Hello, Elizabeth. Thanks for joining me.
Um,
So, tell me a little bit about your journey into Quakers then. What were you seeking and what did you find?
okay. I don't think I was seeking Quakers. I was leaving behind a strange journey from parents who were each very cross with the church in their background, one Catholic and one Church of England, and therefore raised me and my sister as agnostic as they could manage. Um, and I took myself off to a congregational Sunday school with a friend when I was 9 or 10, then to the Church of England and got myself baptized and confirmed. And then my first serious boyfriend was a Church of England curate. And while I was at university, that finished. Um, I was at Newnham College in Cambridge, which doesn't have its own chapel. So groups of us used to go round to other chapels. And I did that for a bit. And I think probably by my third year, I'd stopped. Then, when I was doing voluntary service overseas, one of the questions in the interview was if you encounter a religious tradition or religious statements that go against your own, what would you do? And my answer was, well, I really wouldn't mind very much. And I came to teach in a Quaker school through having done a teaching practice there during my postgraduate year. The head wrote to me while I was in Singapore doing VSO and said he had a vacancy for an English teacher. It was lovely to have something to come back to, so I did that. I had already been to one meeting for worship in Arch Street, Philadelphia. My father, as a young man, spent more than a decade in the States, and a couple who'd been good friends of his had found their way into Quakers, and I stayed with them and went to meeting with them. I've always been a pacifist. I don't know where that comes from. I remember being shocked at the age of what, under 10, by realizing that the reason my father had not fought in the war was because A, he was the wrong age between the First and the Second World Wars. His older brothers were in the First World War. And his company, which was a small specialist electrical engineering company, was turned over to making materiel, Bailey bridges. So he hadn't opted out of the war, he just hadn't gone to fight. Um, Being on the staff at Friends called Saffron Walden was wonderful. I met my first serious Quakers, and we'd been warned during teaching practice to be very careful at the beginning in a new school and make sure you didn't sit in the wrong chair. And for goodness sake, don't pipe up in staff meeting. Well, my very first staff meeting, we were talking about a child that was struggling. And the head turned to me and said, Elizabeth, you're new. What have you noticed? That was quite unexpected. There was always a copy of The Friend on the staff room table, and I read it avidly. And we noticed when visitors came, they would often comment on how much business we managed to do during the 20-minute morning break because we weren't pussyfooting round each other, but going straight to the point.
Mm,
Those were all things I liked. I'm no good at small talk.
mm.
Um, During the time I was at the school, there was a 40-minute period in the middle of Thursday morning, which was known as meeting period. And most of the school sat at their desks, supervised by prefects, doing their own work. But there was a meeting for worship that any teacher or pupil or anybody else could go to. And I went to that, and there was some very good teaching ministry there. So by my fourth year in the school, I was ready to join. I applied. My membership visit was extremely thin. They basically said, oh, you're at the school, you know what you're doing, then have a cup of tea, which was a pity. I've known people have really remarkable membership visits, and I try to be a better visitor than I was a visitee.
Mm.
The end of my fourth year, no, the end of my third year, we got married in the Quaker meeting house in Saffron Walden, which was quite strange. They were in the process of taking out the benches that used to accommodate the whole school. So the gallery had gone and the building wasn't quite finished. But we said we didn't want to get married in the school hall, which was fair enough. My husband was not a friend, though he had had a very good teacher at school who had been one, and he never joined.
Mm.
End of part one, I think.
So,
Oh, I could just say how delightful it was to find a religious community that didn't require me to say things I didn't believe.
mm,
I'd pretty much given up on the Church of England because I couldn't translate the creed quick enough in my head.
yeah, yeah. So quite a long history then of a variety of experiences, actually.
Yes.
And perhaps from what you've described, the school has been one of the formative experiences. One of the things you mentioned there, they had a very good teaching ministry. What does that mean then? Because one of the things that's occurred to me is that we talk about how do we learn about
Mm-hmm.
not just about Quakers and our approach, but about our own, the breadth of our spiritual experience. And a teaching ministry has often been mentioned, but what does that mean? What does it look like?
Well, what it meant was that several senior members of staff were Quakers. And I remember in particular one piece of ministry um, that getting to the top of a mountain is wonderful, but the days when you don't climb mountains are equally important. And it's fruitless to base your life on occasional moments of bliss. That what
Mm,
matters all the time matters. Well, oh, now another thing which did give me more specific learning
mm,
was that there was a habit of the Friends schools having a pilgrimage to the 1652 country. And I went as the teacher with our, what would they be now, year 11 girls. And Elfrida Vifont Foles and Roger Wilson were in full flow going round the various sites. And that was just wonderful.
mm, mm.
So that was specifically teaching, yes.
Yes, so I'm wondering whether a teaching ministry is not just a structured process of helping people learn about things like the 1652
Mm,
visits, but it's also perhaps a readiness, is it, to offer ministry for the
yes,
people who are in the room. Do you
I
think we
think
still
so.
do that?
Well, people who come into our meeting, as you will know, tend to be on this side of 60, but it doesn't mean they don't want to learn. And we've actually just been talking very recently about what we can offer to two people who have been coming pretty regularly and say they're really curious about Friends and how can they learn more. And just pointing them at the library isn't enough, so it may be helpful. And what we've done sometimes, and I hope we might do again, is have a supper where we invite 3 or 4 people and two experienced friends and specifically say this is an opportunity to ask your questions and we'll try to answer them.
Mm, mm,
When I first went to Friends at Ealing, I mean, I was a member, um, but I hadn't been very active. A couple in the meeting who were an elder and an overseer used to have a discussion group on advices and queries, and I think it was ongoing. It happened once a month in their home.
mm.
And I think there was more inviting to each other's homes. I specifically remember that we were asked to pay a penny halfpenny for a cup of tea so that anybody who host Friends would be financially embarrassed.
Yeah, yeah. So, in terms of you staying with Quakers all these years, then what would you say is the main things that you get out of Quaker meeting on a regular basis?
Meeting for worship or being a Quaker as a whole.
What comes to mind?
Okay, I don't know what keeps me at meeting for worship. Um, and in the short term, if I'm away, I don't miss it. I've never stayed away long enough to know whether I would. When I've been working in Rwanda, I have been extremely grateful on getting home to get back to my own kind of worship, I have to say. I don't think I'm terribly good at doing meeting for worship. I prefer there to be some spoken ministry. And my what I have to guard against is ministering too often rather than not often enough.
Mm. So, would you mind saying a bit more about that, if you're willing? What does not being good at meeting for worship mean then?
It means that I don't think I centre down deeply. I would like to be able to. And when people say afterwards, that was a really gathered meeting, I don't actually know what they meant. And
Mm.
that's embarrassing.
Well, good on you for being honest about that, because I'm sure many people, would chime with that. Because one of the things that I'm interested in these conversations is what are the real ways in which Quakers engage in our meetings for worship. And I'm grateful for these conversations. As you said, you kind of let's just get to the point and speak without embarrassment, really, because we're all finding our way in this. And one of the things that I'm trying to explore is how we can help. How can we create a teaching ministry? How can we create some kind of guidance to encourage people in their spiritual journey and encourage them in the depth they can experience. And of course, as you'll know, because I'm a chaplain, I have to do this week
Mm-hmm.
in, week out with people who have got no idea of what Quakers are
Yeah,
and perhaps
yeah.
will never go to Quaker meeting,
Mm-hmm.
more about a spiritual practice. So, do you get the sense that you would be open to that? If a proposal came around of let's try this, do you think there's a general willingness to accept new things in Quaker meetings and the way in which we do meeting for worship?
Yes. I don't know that it all happens in meeting for worship. I do just want to say I thought Quaker Quest worked very well, and I'm sorry that died with COVID, though there is a new replacement whose name I've forgotten, for
Discovering
which I've spoken.
Quakers.
That's the one, yes. Um, we've tried at our meeting sometimes to have post meeting conversation over the tea and coffee, specifically focused on what has happened in meeting for worship. And that hasn't really worked. At the moment, we have an afterword, which is a chance for people to say something that wasn't quite ministry.
Mm,
And we haven't quite fine tuned that. One or two people take it as an opportunity to give a notice, which
mm,
is not what was intended. Um, and we do have short sessions after meeting. We tend to restrict them to an hour because people time is limited. But recently we've done a little series on Quakers in history. There was one on Pennington and one on George Fox, I think,
mm,
and then a lovely one on Margaret Fell and Ada Salter, which
yeah,
ended up with a member of the meeting who's an actor and the other friend dramatising the argument between Margaret Fell and the judge when she was taken to the assizes in Lancaster. And that kind of thing sparks energy, certainly.
yes. Do you, because I suppose that there are different ways into this, isn't there? We've talked about Quaker Quest and asking people to speak about their own journey, and you've just mentioned now kind of stories from the past.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I just wonder what really struck me is when you said, I find it difficult to center down in meetings. And I mean, I don't know you at all, but I'm sure people will probably be surprised,
Mhm.
to hear somebody who's been a Quaker for such a long time.
Yeah.
Just admit that, if you like, almost.
Mhm.
Um,
But you know the saying, pray as you can and not as you can't. I find that extremely helpful. I
yeah.
mean, sometimes I think I'm a big fraud, and I have so little in the way of Christian belief that I ought not to stay at all, though I won't actually leave on those grounds. I can see that people might think I ought to.
Sorry, explain that. What do you mean by that?
Well, that I don't believe on any level other than the entirely symbolic in the resurrection. Um, I'm not interested in the virgin birth. I mean, I understand that that was probably put into the Gospels because of the Hellenistic period in which they were written. That enough?
So what you mean is that even though you don't believe you said something about that you shouldn't leave because of that.
No, I said I probably won't leave because of that. I can see there are people who would think I ought to.
Or because you're not Christian enough, you mean?
Yes, because yes. Um, Something else came into my mind and went out again. I'm sorry, that's common these days.
It's
No,
okay.
just leave it there for now. It may come back.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm quite surprised that you've said that because I don't get any feeling at all that somebody might feel that Quakers aren't for them because they're not Christian enough. That's not a that's
Okay, there certainly are people who think Quakers aren't for them because they're too Christian. We had one woman from the Church of England who stayed with us for 6 years, and then she left saying, "Oh, I do miss Jesus."
exactly, exactly. And you see, I think it would be very good for us to have more of Jesus in our meetings. I really do. Um,
Mm.
and part of that is, what you've just said about finding it difficult to center down. Um, you see, that's not something that I struggle with. I've ever since I began coming to meeting, I realized how simply and quickly and easily I just fall into it, and I'm just very grateful for it, if you like. And
I
I,
just fall asleep. I can't meditate without falling asleep.
right, yeah, interesting. Well, maybe you need more sleep.
Ah,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah, I
I
think.
don't fall asleep at other times.
Yeah, interesting, interesting. So do you get a sense of openness then that if we tried more of a teaching ministry that would guide people into centering down, and trying to, open our hearts to God is the phrase that I've used.
Mhm.
Would that would that be something that you personally would welcome and give it a go? And what do you think about the wider, meeting of friends that you're familiar with?
Okay, I think that leads into the whole question of um, the prophet not being welcome on their own patch. Those aren't quite the usual words. But as soon as you started saying that, I thought, yes, we could do with somebody from Woodbrook. I think it might be quite difficult for somebody within the meeting doing that. It would somehow seem presumptuous.
Yeah. And this is, you see, this for me is one of the cultural issues that we have within Quakers in Britain. Is that
Yeah.
this is one of the the real crucial points, I think, that one of the reasons we sometimes struggle to convey what we do and to teach people what we do, because we're quite reluctant to allow this kind of development. Do you feel content with how Woodbrook and whoever else might come around to meetings and support us? Do you think there are other things that you'd like to see from what they do?
I think I'd like our meeting to get back to using them. We made a specific decision after COVID to focus on maintaining and strengthening the community of the meeting.
Mm,
And we haven't really gone beyond that yet. We are signed up as a sanctuary meeting, but there's nothing active going on in that regard anymore.
mm,
Um, we have periods when we've had interesting visits. Oh dear, what was the couple from Stourbridge who were actors? They came to us several times.
mm.
They did a play about Elizabeth Houghton.
Yes.
Um, you remember? I've forgotten their names, but they've retired now. But they came several times. I think we
Right.
had another acting duo,
Yes.
and
Lynn
that was good.
Smith and
That's right, yes.
mm,
And when we were starting to think about becoming a sanctuary meeting, we decided the first thing we needed to do was educate ourselves. So we invited speakers, one involved with detention for asylum seekers, and somebody from Refugees at Home, which, and I think that's London based. That's a project started by a Jewish woman, where
mm,
people who can afford it put up refugees free, and various informed ourselves about various other things. And we haven't gone back to doing that. I don't think we've had another event to which we've invited public since COVID.
mm,
We may be getting round to that, but I've stopped being an elder and pastoral carer. I did pretty much 12 years on the trot. And this last triennium, I said no.
mm, mm.
So I'm not sure what's going on there.
No.
You know that Hannah Killam in Faith and Practice, where she says, I find it so delightful to be old and not to have to be bothered with things. I don't really, but I try.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm looking forward to that age as well. Um, so you talked.
Oh, yes, and to return just for a moment to the teaching ministry, I
Mm,
do quite often read from Quaker Faith and Practice.
mm,
And when I do, I always introduce the piece in order to set it in a context of then and why it's relevant now.
mm,
And when we had a friend, he's moved, but he used often to read from the Bible. And we worked very hard to persuade him not just to stand up and to give a reading, but either before or after the reading to explain why he'd chosen it now.
mm.
So those things are teaching ministry, I think.
Yes, yes. And as you say, it needs an encouragement, doesn't it? It needs an attitude, if you like, and a kind of a will to, and an openness to it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because perhaps he would have continued saying things without context otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes a certain level of confidence, I think.
I
Um,
think it helps to have been a teacher.
is that where you
I
were?
mean,
Yes,
there
of
are
course.
disadvantages to being having been a teacher, but I do know
Yes.
how to use my voice, and I do, I hope, know how to pitch what I'm saying to my audience.
Yes, and of course I've been a teacher as well, and I wonder if that is perhaps why we look at it from this way of thinking about what is the next developmental stage
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah,
people would benefit from and enjoy,
yeah.
um, and get something from. Well, that phrase you mentioned about not listening to a prophet on your own patch, is that something in Quaker faith and practice? I'm not familiar with
Oh,
it.
I'm pretty sure it's in the Bible, isn't it? A prophet is not welcome in his own country. It
Ah,
could be in Proverbs, but I
right.
certainly no. I don't think it's only Quaker.
No, no. Well, I know the idea, but not that exact phrasing. Um, I think we really struggle with that, really. Um,
It's about partly about authority, isn't it?
mm,
That if you take authority in your own group, people will say, "Oh, that isn't what I came for. We're all equal here."
mm, mm. Yes, we're all equal, and also, some of us take different roles, and there's the hand and the feet.
Well, and we all have gifts, and why
Yes,
not exercise them?
yes,
Yes.
exactly. And I just I suppose I hope to encourage people to think about what gifts they have to offer and to let it shine.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah,
sometimes think that there's not enough confidence across Quakers um, in Britain at the moment, really. Um, I mean, you talked about being abroad. You mentioned Rwanda, I think.
yeah,
And you talked about always being grateful to get back to your home meeting and
yes,
your home form of worship.
yeah.
What else do you remember, or perhaps you've been away recently? What do you notice as the differences?
Oh, well, Rwanda has an evangelical Friends Church, founded from Burundi, um, only in the 1980s. It hadn't been going very long before the genocide. And that form of West Coast American Quakerism, a very much pastoral evangelical tradition, um, and a literal interpretation of the Bible and the use of the Bible as a primary teaching aid, all of which I wouldn't have minded if it was in Kenya, Rwanda, and I could just enjoy the singing. But unfortunately, they had an English language service which I was expected to support, so I couldn't miss what they were saying, and I did find some of it really difficult. Um, and there were also Europeans and Americans there who were comfortable in that evangelical biblical tradition. And I had very good conversations with one or two of them.
Hmm.
But within Rwandan friends, there were also at least two I can think of who described themselves as Quakers and said they would have been much happier in our sort of worship.
Yeah. And how did you navigate that then while you were there? It was what you were given. You were placed there.
It was what I was given. They put up the words of the hymns. I now know quite a lot of the new standards. I always enjoyed harmonising the hymns. That gave me something entertaining to do. Um, yeah, it was the most difficult part of my week, to be honest. But I did it.
And do you think that it gave you anything in return ultimately?
Wish I could say yes.
Mm.
I don't want to seem superior by saying no, but it really didn't speak to me.
Interesting. You see, one of the
I mean,
things.
I thought some of the pastors and some of the pastors' wives were wonderful people, and
Mm.
I learned a lot from them, but not about being a member of the Society of Friends, the worldwide Society of the Friends Society. Well, you know.
I suppose I'm thinking about your own personal spiritual practice and spiritual life,
Mm,
your own journey. I suppose that's what I was wondering because, in the prison system or any context actually where chaplains operate, a chaplain has to respond to the person in front of them,
mm-hmm,
and
yep.
try to find a way to walk alongside that person. And it might be that person is using a completely different frame of reference, really, so that we get called to pray with them or pray for them or
Mm-hmm.
whatever it might be.
I did all that when I was there. I was working through the Friends Church, mostly with women's groups, though also with school staff. Um, and I was teaching people to grow and eat a better variety of vegetables. And with a wonderful Kinyarwandan colleague, we produced a sheet of vitamins and minerals and why your body needs them and which foods you'll find them in. And when I went off to do a day's teaching or a 2 day teaching workshop, I found myself very comfortably referring to, oh, I'm sorry, that will ring, but it'll only ring very, it won't ring very much. I don't know how to shut it off. There we go. Right, now ringing in the other end of the house. Sorry. Yeah. Right.
It's okay, we can't
Um,
hear anything.
where was I? Yes, verses from the Psalms um, about, you know, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And there was another verse from, I think, Ecclesiastes about doing your work and then eating and drinking. And talking about the importance of living comfortably on the earth and sustainably was something that fell very easily into my teaching.
Mm,
And I usually started by inviting the group to think about why we don't have to put fertilizer in the native forest, why we have to put it on the fields and what the differences are. And so that led into thinking about the cycle of creation and the human place in it,
mm.
and how we can cooperate rather than exhausting. So that was all there. And that was easier for me because they had the biblical teaching. And I never minded the praying. I had one co facilitator, translator, who was wonderful. When they said it's time to say the prayers before lunch now, he said, "Now, we don't want to hear about all your children's exams and your mother's illness and this, that, and the other. Just be thankful for the food." Because the prayers did tend to go on rather.
So what do you make of the current concerns and I would say political messaging from friends around sustainability, stewardship, climate change?
Oh, I'm all with Pam Lunn, who wished we could make it one of the integral Quaker testimonies. And I think to some extent that's there now. I don't see how we could not. You know, how can we live lives of simplicity and equality without considering everyone's need and not everyone's greed, and not exceeding the limits of the only earth we've got to live on?
And how would you characterize that then? Because it seems to me that you can think of this as stewardship, and you can think of it
Mm-hmm.
more in you know, for example, Extinction Rebellion, and it, which seems to me um quite a, I don't know, doom-filled approach.
Mm-hmm.
Um, where are you on the doom spectrum?
Well, within Extinction Rebellion, there's the whole range from the people who say it's already too late, but I suppose we might do something, to that wonderful weekend right at the beginning of Extinction Rebellion, where was it London Bridge was taken over and they had a children's playground and a sandpit and they had trees and all the rest of it. And that was certainly joyous.
Mm,
And simply being in a large crowd with a single intention is very good for raising the spirits,
mm,
whether it's for water or refugees welcome here or the various things. I have tended to take part in as many of those activities as I can, pretty much from the anti-nuclear process
yeah.
onwards. I'm doing less now, but that's merely physical.
Yes, but I mean, broadly speaking, I think there is a huge amount of support amongst Quakers, certainly in Britain,
Mm,
around this message. I
yes.
wonder if there's beginning to be some further discernment around how disruptive the protest should be, and I wondered if you've got any thoughts on that. Um,
I wish I could get more interested in the climate majority project because I think it's a very good thing, but somehow it doesn't have the same attractiveness. I should say that one of the four people who are currently serving 4-year prison terms for having had a Zoom meeting planning the protest where the Just Stop Oil people climbed on the gantries and the M25 was an attender at our meeting, and we're now supporting her.
So would you say that you're fully on board with that as a method, if you like, as an approach? Do you think that we're going on the right path with that
I
in
don't think
terms
it's
of
the only path. I think it's one.
mm,
I mean, I think there's a pyramid where at the top people do things which seem outrageous or ridiculous. And I remember, for example, when I was going to the protest at Molesworth, where the cruise missiles were, there were two older Quaker women who were digging up a little patch of ground and trying to teach the young protesters how to grow potatoes. And they said, you may not think so, but you may need this within your lifetimes.
mm.
So there's that sort of going beyond what seems to be necessary. And I have been on one or two Just Stop Oil protests. And I actually stopped because the modern campaigning method seems to spend such a long time talking about what are we going to do and is everybody happy with it, that nothing much happens.
Yes,
There
yes.
you go.
But you see, do you not worry then, like I do, that for a young person hearing this, that I mean, if you're saying you might need to learn how to grow potatoes, I'm assuming that you're thinking that there's going to be such a collapse of all the systems by which
Mm,
food would be brought to us that we will need to be self-sufficient again.
yeah,
That must terrify young people.
I think they're terrified anyway. They know they're taught in primary schools that we have to look after the earth better.
Hmm.
And I mean, I'm extremely admiring of these teenagers and young adults who become extremely active. And I know there are a great many more who don't. But I think it's a mistake to think that young people are not worried about the future and who look at us and say, why didn't you do something? No, it's all happened in my lifetime. I
Hmm.
was born in 42, so I've seen the whole scope of pesticides and intensive agriculture and money on armaments and all the rest. And at every point, I would have liked to be able to stop it.
But it's not within our gift, is it? I mean, I suppose that uh, the reason that I really want to just ask some questions about this is, the spiritual tradition that we're from says perfect love casts out fear. And
Mm,
yet a large part of what we do within our culture at the moment
yeah,
is to spread fear about the future. And especially then, as we've just said, young people are going to be terrified by that.
I
Why
think
aren't
there's a
we
very
talking
big,
about perfect love instead?
well, I think there's a big effort to do that as well. Um, and I think there's a journalistic habit of always looking for what's wrong
Mm,
and even trying to undermine what's right. And the search for truth can be so directed to that good news is not news. And very many of the changes that we need to make to live more sustainably could give us better lives. I would love not to be surrounded by traffic jams. No,
yeah.
London's air has improved since we started the congestion charge, but the Conservatives won a by-election in Hillingdon simply by saying how wrong it was to stop people driving their cars.
Mm, mm. What do you
It's
think about the net zero? You
well, I
know,
just wish we'd get on with it. And the
it's not
longer
going
we
to
leave it, the
happen, though,
more
is it?
expensive it's going to be.
Do you think
I
it's ever going
no,
to happen?
I well, I don't really want to talk party politics.
No.
Is that a good use of our time? I'm extremely glad there are four Green MPs. Let's leave it at that.
Yes. I suppose I'm glad you say let's not talk about party politics because I don't want to. I suppose what I'm concerned about is that I would love Quakers to talk more about the perfect love and
Mhm,
less about party politics. And I think there's an awful lot of politics that comes into the way in which we do Quakers at the moment.
mhm.
Is that something that concerns you?
Yes, and it concerns me about myself. We've a friend in meeting who encourages us every now and then to turn off the news.
Mm,
I find that really difficult.
yeah.
I grew up in a family that took an interest in what was going on.
Mm,
We have a historical interlude for a moment. My father, when he was in the States, worked with General Electric, and they built the first hydroelectric dam in the Soviet Union, and it was in Ukraine at Dnipropetrovsk. And he came home from that in the 30s, having seen the persecution of the gulags. And the election poster that was in our window in 1951, when I was 8 years old, said, "Socialism leads to communism, vote Conservative." And I was raised in that school of thought. So
oh,
politics has always been important.
interesting. Interesting. And yet here you are just saying that the Conservatives have trashed your
Oh,
the
I'm not a conservative, never have
no.
been. I did my teenage rebellion by becoming a socialist.
Yes, well that's what I'm
Yeah.
noticing. It's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, I suppose that this is one of the things that I'm trying to get at, really. Is it the case that all Quakers in Britain now, like 95% of people think like you?
I
Is
doubt
it?
if it's as high as that, but certainly 80%. And that I'm sorry about that. I think it's a mistake. We have one friend in my meeting who is always challenging people when they express left wing opinions. And he says, "I'm not doing it to be provocative, but I'm really curious about the truth."
Yes.
And that's very useful.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that because I mean, I'm not against this majority opinion myself, particularly, but I really worry that we've become a silo of political opinion. And we say we value inclusiveness and we value diversity in our worshipping community, and yet I don't see that we put that into play into action, really. In what way does it worry you that 80% all think the same?
Well, I agree with them, but us, I'm part of the 80%, certainly. I wish we could move nearer to the position of what, 150, 200 years ago, where whole households followed the religious practice of the master and mistress. So we would have had a much broader range of practical and intellectual um, views than we have when we're now self selecting.
So what are you referring to there? Sorry, that all of the
Well,
staff within a
the
particular
whole
house.
household, if it was a Quaker house, the whole household would practice Quaker, whatever. I mean, it would have been more Christian than it is now, but they would have said grace before meals. They would have listened to Bible study. They would have gone to meeting. So the meeting for worship, although it may well be that it was only the better educated people who tended to speak, I don't know. Um, at least the whole range of society was there, and not just our middle class, highly educated clique.
Yes. Because of course these are the conversations or the kinds of people I mix with in the prison system. are not the middle class,
Indeed.
highly
Yes.
educated cliques. And I talk
Yes.
about things in a very different way than
Mm.
I do in local meeting. And I think
Yes.
that's
Well, I
what's
wish
led.
they'd come, but they won't. In the same way as we're very disappointed when we've had people who are not white usually don't stay.
I know that's very disappointing as well. But and although we talk about what those issues are, where we've now gone to with that, for example, is talking about reparations, which is for me a complete side issue, and it really doesn't look at questioning how we are as a culture today, week in,
Yeah.
week out in our meetings.
And yes, I mean, a lot of people say that reparation is really important.
Well,
Look at David Olusoga, who
I
did all that work on how, the slave owners were compensated and not the slaves.
yes. I mean, I'm not saying it's not important, but it feels to me like the easy way out. It's really fairly
Yes,
well off people throwing some money at the problem without having to examine their comfortable meetings on a Sunday.
I don't actually think the money is the important part. I think it is important to look back and say, these are things that happened in this community before our lifetimes, and we wish they hadn't. And what can we do now?
Yes.
And it may well not be money.
It may well not be. And I just wonder if part of the reason people don't stay typically nowadays is because we can't accept this diversity of opinion. And I'm very glad to hear the story of your friend in your local meeting
Yeah.
who is sometimes challenging.
Hmm.
And I suppose I'm trying to do the same really. But it's not received very well.
No, it isn't. No.
And so that's why I see it's a little bit is a hypocrisy. It's a little bit far-fetched to think that Quakers want to be more diverse, but we can't
Mhm.
even accept somebody who differs even slightly from us in our
Yep.
viewpoints.
Yes, I agree. It
What do we
is.
do
It is
about
difficult.
this then?
Oh, ask somebody else.
Well, one of the questions I finish with is what are your hopes for the future? And this to me seems a relevant issue, with the benefit of your wisdom. What do we think about the future and how do we prepare for it?
I wish I was more interested in the future. I'm not interested in what happens after death. And while I care terribly about not wrecking the earth, because I want future generations to enjoy it as much as I have, I'm no longer putting energy into future planning.
Hmm.
Um, I have an allotment. That's one of the centers of my spiritual life.
And what about Quakers? Do you have hopes for the future of Quakers?
Yes, but I'm not terribly obsessed by it. I don't know what will happen, and I don't think it's for me to determine it. I don't think it's right to say that only the under 30s should be making decisions. Was it in the Friend there's been some correspondence about not neglecting the wisdom of people who've been alive for a long time?
Yes.
We need both, but it's not where I'm putting my energy at the moment.
Yes. And there comes
I
a point,
do.
as you've said, where stepping back and letting others make those
Mhm.
decisions is just the right thing for you and the right thing for the meeting, perhaps, to allow new voices to come forward.
Yes, and I try to live a testimony of simplicity as far as I can at my age and in my circumstances.
Hmm.
It worries me that my house is too big. I do have a lodger, but I've looked for somewhere smaller round here and there don't seem to be any options. I have an allotment I sing in a choir and a small group. I volunteer at my food bank. I play bridge. You may not think that's Quakerly. I'm embedded in the social fabric of this place, and I don't want to leave until I have to.
Mm,
I do have a car. I don't drive it much. I'm very fortunate that the London transport is brilliant, and I don't need it very much. But I carry people, I carry heavy shopping, I carry the produce from my allotment to give it away at meetings so people can share it,
mm,
because I'm a one person household and there wouldn't be any point in growing the food if it wasn't used. I try to live a balanced life, but tipping towards the unextravagant at least.
mm,
Um, so I try to live a witness. I don't do a lot of public stuff anymore. I sometimes write to my MP, not as often as I write a letter in my head.
mm,
I'm working up at the moment to saying, for goodness sake, just put a penny on income tax. Stop this cut, cut, cut. And while I'm sorry, we need the country wishes to support the armed services, at least that would be a reason why people would be prepared to see the tax going up. And I'm not sure whether that's unethical to make that argument, but it does seem to me that it's a reasonable one. Both a wealth tax and a penny on income tax would then, sorry, I've become party political again, would then enable the government not to have to keep cutting
mm,
while desperately struggling not to call it austerity.
mm, mm.
So, in those kinds of ways, I try to stay engaged.
Yes, yes. Well, and I'm sure that, within the whole of Quakers, these are the kinds of conversations that are happening up and down the country, aren't they?
I would think so.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm. So do you feel that we still have something to offer the new generations coming through?
Oh, yes. Yes. We have young people coming to our meeting. None of them at the moment have come into membership. They tend to come and then drift away. And over the years, because we're a London suburb, young families have often found it necessary to move out, either to be able
Mm,
to afford to buy a house or because their careers take them away. But when I went to meeting, it was wonderful to see people towards the end of their Quaker lives willing to share what they'd learned and willing to provide a context into which I could fit. And I hope we still do that.
mm. Yes. Well, I'm sure we do. I'm sure we do. Well, that's great. Thank you very much. That's a lovely conversation. So thank you for talking to me today.
Oh, thank you, Emma.